All right, welcome to Black Lives in the Media System, a special conversation. I am your host and moderator, Stephen Renderos, and my pronouns are he, him. This event is part of the Black Narrative Power series presented by Media 2070, a project of free press. Media 2070 is aimed at radically transforming who has the capital to tell their own stories by 2070, so approximately 50 years from today. In order to get to that future, we have to understand the past. And that's why Media 2070 launched with a research essay detailing the history of U.S. media participation in anti-Black racism and harm, and issues a call to action to repair the harm media institutions have caused. I invite you to read this powerful essay and dream up media reparations at media2070.org. As we kick off this special conversation, I want to invite you, the audience, to join us in a parallel conversation online by dropping comments into the Facebook stream. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you happen to be on the Twitters, use the hashtag Black Narratives Matter. So I'm excited to be in conversation with these two beautiful people that I'm about to introduce, who have been so instrumental in shaping my own analysis and my own activism in this space. So I'd like to briefly introduce each of them. First up is Malkia Devich-Cyril, who go by the pronouns they, them. Malkia is an activist, also known by some close friends as Mac. What's up, Mac? I see you there. Is an activist, is a writer, is a public speaker on issues from digital rights, narrative power, Black liberation, and collective grief. Devich-Cyril is also the founding and former executive director, so I had my old job, at MediaJustice. So we can debate later if I'm the new Mac or if you're the old Steven.
I'm definitely the old Steven.
And after more than 10 years of organizational leadership at MediaJustice, Devich-Cyril is now our senior fellow, and we're super, super lucky to have you still around as a contributing writer to various publications. You get your work out there quite a bit to The Atlantic, Wired Magazine, TechCrunch. I got the Washington Post in here, Truth Out. I've seen The Guardian before. And of course, you've contributed to some wonderful projects out there like We Will Not Cancel Us, a book by Adrienne Maree Brown. And of course, a lot of folks would know you, and they pulled you off of the street because they've seen you in a wonderful documentary by Ava DuVernay, The 13th, out on Netflix today. No, it's been on Netflix for a while. The other thing I'll say is in 2002, Mac, you were a part of helping to coin the term media justice. And so excited to have you here as such a visionary leader in this space that has been shaping the conversation at this intersection of media and race. Next up, with the pronouns he, him, is Joseph Torres, the Senior Director of Strategy and Engagement at Free Press. Joseph writes frequently on media and internet issues and is the co-author, a New York Times best-selling author, I should add, for News for All the People, co-written with Juan Gonzalez, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media. He's also the 2015 recipient of the Everett C. Parker Award, and recognizes an individual whose work embodies the principles and values of the public interest. Before joining Free Press, Joe worked as the deputy director at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and was a journalist himself for many years. One claim to fame that Joe often talks to me about is the fact that he used to write a newsletter read by the one and only Jimmy Smits, which we can get into that later. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's begin with the current moment. So 2020 was a monumental year. COVID, the elections this past fall, the continued violence, police violence from communities like Minneapolis to Louisville, they've all laid bare the pandemic of racism in the United States. Black people are experiencing the greatest harms with higher rates of death due to COVID. The false narrative of a stolen election, really largely centering on delegitimizing the Black vote from places like Detroit and Atlanta. The Derek Chauvin case was just kicked off this week, right? One of the police officers responsible for the killing of George Floyd, and yet a lot of the headlines that we see are the George Floyd trial is getting underway this week. So, everywhere I turn, I read headlines, I see videos, and I see a society that isn't valuing Black life. And so I want to start with you, Mac. Help us understand in today's moment, like the visible narrative harms and other forms of anti-Black harm that are being caused by media racism. You know, how are we continuing to experience them, today?
Big question for a big conversation. First of all, Stephen, thank you for that great introduction. And I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you and with Joe. You know, as a Black person who has worked at this intersection of media and race, this past year has been astonishing. We talk about, there's been a lot of studies, done about the overrepresentation of Black folk as super predators, criminals, right? The criminalization of Black bodies. We've seen Black folk represented as like these super athletes too, right? On both ends of that, right? Whether you consider one negative and one positive, the result is the same, right? It leads to this very dangerous and explicit belief and reality that we are easier to kill with impunity, that we can take pain better, that we don't need the same level and quality of healthcare, right? That and all of this normalized white supremacy, this explicit white supremacy results in our decreased mortality. So these are narratives that directly lead to death. This isn't a question of microaggressions. This isn't about implicit bias. This is about seriously the coverage of the issues of the day, the coverage of the economy, the coverage of COVID, the coverage of police violence, all of it, the coverage of the election, all of it explicitly condones the killing of Black people. Now, I know that's a controversial position. There's a lot of journalists who are absolutely struggling to be fair, absolutely trying to work within, a very biased system and do their best. So this is not about individuals and what they fail to do. This is about a narrative system that's composed of infrastructure, institutions, policies, people, protocols. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a narrative system that is quite murderous, And the fact is, as outlets have struggled for resources, right? Investigative journalism has waned and punditry has risen. We've seen the emergence since the 80s of a right-wing media ecosystem, or some might call it an echo chamber. And what it's echoing is that Black life doesn't matter. That's what it's echoing loud and clear. We can all hear it. We're talking about, whether with, at the same time, right, that this system is advancing the narrative that, normalizes white supremacy, it's ostracizing and marginalizing the narrative of Black liberation. That said, Black people have come out onto the street in the millions. Our allies have come out with us. And so I want to say that not all narrative is created by the media, right? Some of this narrative is being created in the street, if that makes sense, We saw the attacks, right, on the 1619 Project. That was a perfect example of this kind of tension, right? And I'm not talking about the healthy debate, between historians. Some were appropriately concerned about this question of cynicism versus necessary hope that was in or excluded from that project. I'm talking about when the then President Trump attacked the project as toxic ideology, ideological poison, right? Took his presidency to mischaracterize critical race theory, issuing an executive order to form the 1776 Commission promoting, quote, patriotic education. I'm saying just like Black people are creating narrative in the street, white supremacists are creating narrative in the classroom, creating narrative in academia, creating narrative as policy in the White House. So, these visceral harms that we're witnessing, the mortal harms that we're witnessing on Black bodies coming from this media system, they're dangerous and they're deadly.
Thanks, Mac. And I want to pass it over to you, Joe, to kind of expand on that. And speaking of that tension of like the white supremacy shaping narratives, but also communities of color trying to hold, Black people in particular, trying to hold and shape our, their own stories. That's a tension that has been around for a really long time. And I actually think within Media 2070, the essay, but also in News for All the People, Joe, you literally wrote the book of that history. So I'm curious if you could kind of expand on Mac's, pick up where Mac left off and give us a sense of like, what is that history of media harm? How is that reflected in what we see and experience today?
Well, Mac says so much, it's one of these things where it says so much, like I'm trying to think how to answer the question, and just going off what you asked me, the fact is that the history of our media system has been a media system is like any other media system that has been created in this country. It wasn't created to help Black folks. It's been often created to harm Black folks. And with the media system, our media system was created from the very first printed word in our country, first continuous newspaper in our country to the present day of trying to uphold a white racial hierarchy. The media system, it is like any other system that exists in our country. And so, the work we've been doing through the years, you and I and Mac and others, we're trying to visualize this system because the goal has always been to create a myth of Black inferiority, right? That's one of the roles that the media system and media companies play a role in the creation of narratives, as Mac said. And narratives are a political tool that have been weaponized, right, to harm Black folks. It's been used to harm to Indigenous folks. It's been harmed to like other folks of color as well. And so what we're seeing today is that like these narratives still persist. These narratives carry on because literally racism is baked into the design of our media system, right? We have white dominant media owners. And so if the narrative about Black folks are a danger to this country, right? And if that narrative has persisted for centuries, that tell you that narrative is precisely what it was designed to do, right? And now we see it in our algorithms, right? And how how Facebook and Twitter and all that, like how they help, that they try to use these narratives and in these algorithms to shape conflict in order to get more viewers and to incentivize traffic, right? So these narratives serve a purpose and is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Fortunately, throughout the history of our country, there have been Black folks who have been fighting this narrative, right? And so, we talk about in the book that Juan and I wrote, and it's very famously Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper in 1827 in New York. And then there's Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass, and there's been all sorts of Black folks working, creating known Black newspapers to challenge narratives and to inform their community as well. We talk about in the paper the Chicago race riot, right? After the Chicago race riot, one of the first commissions was formed to examine it. It was made up of Black folks and white folks, right, to address issue of racism. One of the first kind of reports what happened in Chicago, right? It was examining what exactly happened in Chicago and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. It was one of the first kind of reports that ever existed like this before, and they talk about the role of media, and how the white dominant newspapers incited violence, helped to incite violence in Chicago. That resulted in more Black folks being killed than white folks, and many more Black folks being harmed. And meanwhile, the white newspapers would talk about more white folks were being killed during the riot, and more white folks were being physically harmed, right? And so we go to today. We have we have all these right wing networks, and we have hate groups organizing online, but also we have so-called more progressive media outlets as well, who, when you look at like cable punditry, as Mac was saying, you look at MSNBC or CNN, for example, and the way they cover race as a spectator sport. Like, it's like, this person said this, and how can we react to get, they do the same thing as social media companies to try to agitate folks to turn on their network, to turn on their television, because it's based on conflict, in order to get more viewers for their programs. And I say, like, today, like, you know, I look at Malkia Devich-Cyril and Devich-Cyril, and I look at MediaJustice and all these other, like, activists of color who use the means of communications to try to keep their communities informed, because we have a dominant media system that doesn't do it. And they may not see themselves, a lot of these activists, as like practicing journalism, let's say, like in the traditional sense, but they are performing acts of journalism by continuing to inform their community about what's going on in this country, that in their communities, that the dominant media system is not covering. So when you see all these activists and using digital platforms, and these digital platforms we can get into are very harmful, but they're also truth tellers. They're also using the mass media, this is all a part of what we're doing here right now on online. It's all a part of the mass media continue to speak our truths, you know? And so, you know, I'll just end with, you know, with that. What give me hope this year is more people, you know, more people into the streets, as Malkia said, but also more journalists of color, more Black journalists that we have seen in recent memory has spoken up last year in newsrooms. They've been forcing a racial reckoning in newsrooms across the country. The Kansas City Star apologized for its history of racism in December. The Los Angeles Times apologized, and more Black journalists and journalists of color are calling on their newsrooms to reckon with the history of racism at these white dominant institutions. So
I appreciate that point a lot, because I think it's, you know, the racial reckoning that we see happening in media institutions, we can't divorce that from what Mac was raising, the largest, biggest mobilization of a movement ever in our history. Those two are related. And the activism that people are taking on in the streets, that creates the space for these other conversations to shake loose and to move forward conversations that have been, you know, had been ignored for far too long. So thank you both for helping us understand some of that current context and current harm. You know, one of the things that I love about Media 2070 is that its goal is oriented towards a vision of repair, you know, one that centers Black narrative power as a vehicle to get there. So we want to play a short video to kind of help explore that a little bit further. So hang tight with us. We'll be right back on the other side of this.
And when you think of Black narrative power, give me your top 3 words that come to mind.
To me, 3 phrases and words that come to mind when I think about this incredible narrative power is in motion, dynamic, and possibility.
Ownership, intervention, education.
I think liberation, self-determination, maroonage, one of the things that we see in some of the alternative building and the different kinds of communication strategies that are being created for Black folks to be able to tell our stories are really working in the lineage of maroonage, which is an abolitionist strategy where you create alternatives to whatever kind of subjugation or exploitation is happening so that other folks can envision what's possible and know what they're fighting for.
Think about being inclusive, that recognizing that there's intersection within all of this work, whether we're talking about Black narrative power, Indigenous narrative power, Latinx narrative power, that this power is shared, that we need to build power within our own communities, using our own stories, using our own voices.
If you're just tuning in, you're watching Black Lives in the Media System, a special conversation brought to you by Media 2070. I am your host and moderator, Stephen Renderos, and I'm in a special conversation with Malkia Devich-Cyril and Joseph Torres. For folks watching live right now, help us continue a parallel conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag Black Narratives Matter. And feel free to put comments into the Facebook stream. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know where you're coming from. Feel free to do quotables. Mac and Joe have plenty of quotables that they've already shared so far. So help us memorialize some of that in the comments. So thank you for that. Now, I want to come back to you, Mac. You were raised in the movement for Black liberation. Your mother, Janet Cyril, was a Black Panther.
Yes.
You often tell stories about how your mom, growing up, you might be taking a walk down to the grocery store, but that walk down to the grocery store could quickly become a march and a protest and a public action, like hella quick. The other thing you've often told me is, how she would encourage your writing, and in fact, probably would make you read stuff that you wrote out in those protests and marches out in the streets.
Yes.
You've made a career of speaking about media racism, and you even helped to coin the term media justice. So I'm curious to kind of learn from that trajectory, coming from a tradition of like Black liberation to the work that has really embodied your career. What sparked that joy or that kind of focus on media activism for you?
What is really a who? I mean, you brought up my mother. And, my mother, like you said, was a member of the Black Panther Party, but I'll take it further that she was in charge of the New York Panthers breakfast program, as well as a writer for the Black Panther paper. And so my mother believed inherently in the power of culture to shape action. She truly believed in this idea of culture before politics, or just the idea that culture and politics were related to each other. She taught us that from yay high. You feel me? We were children in a Black liberation school learning songs of Black liberation, learning to say, praise the red, the black, and the green. Brothers and sisters will be redeemed. Open up your eyes and see, we on our way to being free. I mean, that's, 5 years old, and so, and when I came out as queer, at the age of 12 and a half, my mother decided that rather than, struggle with me, she decided to struggle with her own homophobia. And the way that she did that was by taking me on a talk show tour, putting me on Sally Jesse Raphael. She went on Oprah, Montel Williams, Best Talk in Town, all of these talk shows. I think I was about 15 at this point, to talk about the struggle of being a queer youth of color, a Black young person in a white supremacist system. She believed that media had power. She believed in the power of poetry and writing, and she passed those beliefs on to me. And she taught me very clearly that look, we don't often associate the words abolition, reparations, truth and reconciliation with media. But let's be clear, and this is what my mother taught me, that this system, this media system that is comprised of people, but also, as we mentioned, of infrastructure, rules, regulations, they create both official and unofficial stories. That news media has created a very official story about Black criminalization, as well as an unofficial story within entertainment, right? How many shows in the primetime period are cop shows? How many of those shows are consistently showing people of color, and particularly Black people, as criminals? This is what I grew up with. Now, growing up in Brooklyn, I'm from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, in the 80s. Look, I remember the Central Park 5 case, right? I remember how Trump was part of, amplifying this media misrepresentation of Black youth that led to the conviction of 5 innocent kids. Their conviction, right, we know was later overturned, but that he could put out a full-page ad in a newspaper calling for their death, and that I think it was it the Daily News or the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, that he put it out, and he could do that. He could do that because he was rich and he was white and he was a man. I remember the language: crack baby, AIDS patient, super predator, welfare mom, and how all of these portrayals became part of this official story with books like The Bell Curve and others, right? That told this story of our inferiority. And this is the 80s and the 90s, not the 50s, not the 30s and the 20s, not the 1800s. This is just a few years ago, basically, in my lifetime, when it's happening today, right? And not to mention, it was because of my mother that I also began to understand not just the fact that media played a role, a primary role, formative role in structuring and creating these narratives, but also that media has historically provided the infrastructure for our enslavement, for our surveillance, right? And we already know Joe has told us, and his book reveals in great clarity the way that newspapers were used to capture Black slaves, or the enslaved Black people. We were not slaves; we were enslaved. Words matter. But also, he helped us understand that in the 60s, in the 50s, how AT&T also colluded, right, with the police and the FBI, to surveil Black activists. We know that AT&T, for example, continues to collaborate with the NSA today, right? They provide today, not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago, today, they provide direct backbone access to raw data that passes through, right? I'm talking about including emails, web browsers, social media, and other, types of unencrypted online activity. We know that the NSA uses the web of 8 AT&T hubs for a surveillance operation codenamed Fairview. We know that. It's been documented. It's been written about in reputable outlets. We already know that, and the NSA has admitted to it. So the issue isn't like, and it has never been, whether or not this media system is racist. It is. It is. Black activists have been historically demonized, and my mother taught me that. She also taught me, though, that democratizing culture, democratizing that infrastructure might be it's a liberation strategy. It's a tool for our freedom, It's a path that we have to walk. It's a parallel freedom struggle. Dr. King knew it, Malcolm X knew it, Fannie Lou Hamer knew it, right? We all know that in order to transform the material conditions of our lives, we also have to transform the cultural ones. That's what my mother taught me. And so that's kind of how I came to it today.
Big love and an honor to Janet Cyril for the impact that she made in this world, not only in her lifetime, but certainly in your lifetime, Mac. And I've actually seen the segment from Phil Donahue. That video exists somewhere. I've seen it.
Races and everything. Yeah.
I want to come to you, Joe. You entered from a different place, but you'll also be required to sing, much like Mac did. You started out as a journalist and then became a media policy advocate. And, a lot of that work is centered in Washington, D.C. You obviously wrote a book at a certain point. You wrote News for All the People and have been super instrumental within Free Press in the shaping of Media 2070. So I guess I'm curious, what sparked that shift for you away from journalism, kind of day to day, covering the news of the day, to trying to fight to transform it. And maybe what about journalism has actually informed, what you do, how you approach the work?
So, I've been fortunate there's a lot of great journalists out there, and a lot of great journalists of color, right? Black journalists, Latinx journalists, and Asian American journalists, Native American. There's a lot of great journalists out there doing their best they can to make sure the voices of the community are being heard and the stories that need to be told. But they work within the media system and media companies, white dominant media companies that don't value their voices, right? And so, you know, like my path is definitely different. You know, I'm a Puerto Rican kid who grew up in New York City, all over Bronx. I lived in East New York, Brooklyn, and then my parents moved to Staten Island, where like my consciousness about like being the person of color, being Puerto Rican, started to form, because living in the Bronx and Brooklyn, growing up as a kid, I didn't think about what does it mean to be Puerto Rican? I was just amongst my family members and folks in the community. But when I moved into a predominantly white borough, right, in Staten Island, then it started to understand like what is like understand like how racism, beginning to understand, like try to understand the history, because you know this stuff is not taught to us in public school. I mean, as a Puerto Rican kid growing up in New York City and going to schools in New York, I don't remember learning anything about this stuff, anything about race and racism and anything. And so when I was in college, you know, like there was a professor who took time in a communications class to talk to me, and she would bring in media, she would bring in papers and stuff like that. It was alternative newspapers and publications to the New York Times. And I remember we were talking about the coverage of Eleanor Bumpurs, who was killed by the police in New York City, right? Like 30 years ago. And just, I got interested in media. I got an internship. I worked as a journalist and for several years, and I went to the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And it's really, you know, I started to like try to get involved in the media system and issues of media policy, because all this consolidation was happening in the late 90s after the 1996 Telecom Act. You know, Clear Channel went from owning 40 stations in 1996 to 1,200 stations in 2 years. And Clear Channel, which is iHeartRadio now, is one of the biggest distributors of like right-wing hate radio, right? And I knew like this could not be good for communities of color. I was working at the Hispanic Journalists Association, especially like journalists of color, and I started to learn. I started to read about it, right? And then I was fortunate and blessed that Juan Gonzalez became president of NHJ in 2002, and we started to tackle all the consolidation that the Bush administration was proposing under Michael Powell, who's the son of Colin Powell, calling for massive consolidation. And we got engaged, and we got the National Association of Black Journalists engaged, and others engaged, and we wrote a white paper in 2004 called "How Long Must We Wait?" And that was an effort to organize journalists of color to challenge media policy, right, the racist media policy, and you know, and that got me to and then I've been shaped, you know, like obviously by like coming from a more mainstream organization, let's say, to working within the you know, media and tech policy groups, but meeting people like you and Mac, you know, and other activists of color, and so I'll just say like I'm passionate about this because I believe it's going to be hard we need media reparations for the Black community because it's like the fight for reparations is going on for centuries. There's nothing new about this struggle for reparations, right? And it's going to be hard to achieve Black liberation without challenging a narrative and changing a narrative. The narrative allows a weaponized political narrative that dehumanizes folks, allows lawmakers to be able to pass policies that benefit an elite few for capitalism gains, right? And by extracting and exploiting and controlling folks, right? And you need a policy to be able to do that stuff. You need a narrative to be able to do that, so you can pass these policies, right? And if the narrative doesn't change, it's going to be hard to fight for all kind of issues of liberation when it comes to the Black community on a number of fronts, right? It's just harder. It's just harder when you don't have a narrative. My colleague Alicia Bell on the Media 2070 project, for instance, calls Donald. She mentioned one time Donald Trump is a cultural organizer. That's what he really is. And we're talking about racist media systems. Donald Trump is a media creation, as Malkia was talking about with the Central Park Five The person who runs CNN, Jeff Zucker, was the person who greenlighted The Apprentice. And when Color of Change was challenging NBC for carrying The Apprentice after Trump got into birtherism, remember all these years of birtherism, he stayed on. Trump went on Saturday Night Live when that year where he was running for president, and it was a totally racist campaign. He was on Jimmy Fallon. I was on a panel with a top media critic, and he was like, before the election, anyone thought he was going to lose. Like, this wasn't really. He was saying why is he getting so much coverage? Like, the camera loves him. It's like, and he was like, because it's a great story. For them, it was a great story, right? It was a great story, but for Black folks and communities of color, it was an existential threat, right? And I'll end with this. If folks can read the Media 2070 essay at Media 2070, MediaReparations.org, because media policy also has resulted in this massive consolidation, and lawmakers in the Federal Communications Commission, in this case, they're supposed to pass policies that serve a public good, a public interest, right? These airways, right, are the public airways, right? But we have a de facto media apartheid system, and it's by design. And so if the FCC, if they're passing policies supposed to be serving a public interest, they're not considering the interests of communities of color to create this kind of de facto media apartheid system. So the history of policy making that has created this media system that has made Rupert Murdoch who he is, right, and AT&T and Comcast, it's because decisions policymakers make. And that's led to the exclusion of Black folks from our media system, and particularly from ownership opportunities, right? The greatest job promotion you can have is to actually be the owner and control the means of distribution, right? And so this is why we have to fight for media reparations, to reconcile the history of harm, and to imagine a new and just media system. Because if we have a just media system that helps to birth Black liberation or makes it possible for Black liberation, it actually creates the kind of society I think we all want to live in. So I'll stop there.
Right. And to that point around ownership, today, less than 5% of the TV stations, radio stations out there are owned by people of color. And so, and I think what both of y'all are talking about is there are deliberate choices here that are made and that shape the culture, that shape representation in media. These are not just a byproduct of randomness or coincidence. Like there are deliberate choices that are being made here. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Black Lives in the Media System, a special conversation brought to you by Media 2070. I'm your host, Stephen Renderos, and I'm in a special conversation here with Malkia Devich-Cyril and Joseph Torres. Please follow us online. Join the parallel conversation using the hashtag on Twitter, Black Narratives Matter. So I want to talk about how the nature of media harm has changed. One interesting thing is I met you, Mac, at the same conference that I first saw Joe at. It was in 2008. I didn't meet Joe there. He was, you know how like memories sometimes fail you as a kid. You think someone is like massively tall, much bigger than like you remember, and then when you meet them in real life, they're like not as tall at all. I remember thinking Joe was like this giant figure that when I saw you at a workshop at the National Conference on Media Reform in 2008 in Minneapolis. That was also happened to be the first time I met Mac. Mac doesn't remember, but it's all good. One of the speeches I remember hearing that at that conference was Robert McChesney, one of the founders of Free Press, who talked about how there was this kind of unique moment in 2008 where the internet was democratizing speech in a way that had been kind of unparalleled before. It was removing all these media gatekeepers out of the way. And there was this real unique moment where we could harness narrative power and just the power of speech in a different way. Obviously, the last 12 years have shown us how the media system is a little more resilient than that. And so I'm curious, y'all have touched on some of the ways in which harm continues to happen today, some of the innovations beyond media into technology, but I'm curious if you can add a little bit more, and I'll start with you, Mac, of what do you see now that perhaps you didn't anticipate, an evolution that maybe surprised you And you know, I'll start there. How about that?
Okay. You know, so you mentioned earlier that in 2002, you know, we gathered at the Highlander Center, and the group of people that I gathered with, coined the term media justice. I was one of several, you know, and but the fact is that the term had been in use, you know, randomly, like, you know, sporadically here and there. But the reason we needed to coin it and give it meaning and visibility was because we were in a situation where the media harm was devastating Black communities, but the path to justice, you know, that the folks who are working on the policy issues were primarily white men, you know, and so we wanted to correct that. Now, one of the things you asked me, what surprises me, what I could have anticipated or not anticipated, I absolutely anticipated that in 20 years we would have a movement that defined itself, a movement for media justice that defined itself as a racial justice movement. That was the vision. And I feel we have accomplished that part of the vision. So I say an amen to that one. But, you know, also, you know, we were at the time, like 2000, you know, 2004, we were campaigning against Clear Channel Radio, right, which exploded after the 1996 Telecom Act, trying to hold them accountable to young people of color, you know, because while they were exploiting our music, you know, they were also participating in our demise. But, you know, and we did that, you know, for some time, really, really focusing on that kind of infrastructure. But I'm going to tell you, you know, that 2008, 2009 period when the internet really exploded and these platforms exploded, and we thought, because we saw the Arab Spring, right? We saw Twitter, you know, we thought, hey, Twitter is giving voice to the voiceless, you know, allowing folks in these countries who are fighting for liberation to have this voice that otherwise they might not have had. And that was a narrative, that was a spin, you know, but that's what neoliberalism does. It spins that this particular form of democracy is really the only possible form. So we'll come back to that another time. But we saw the Arab Spring, you know, we saw Occupy, right? And we thought to ourselves, yes, what we need to do is we need to defend this infrastructure called the internet. And we did so. We fought for net neutrality. We fought to close the digital divide. We did a whole bunch of work. Now, you asked me about anticipation. Now here's the thing. Can you anticipate the rise of a powerful white right wing? Well, absolutely. I mean, we came from a powerful, you know, the nation was built in part, right, by a powerful white right wing, you know, so of course there will always be ebb and flow until there are not only laws but real infrastructure to keep the white supremacists at bay, right? So yes, we could have predicted that. You know, the dynamics of power, you know, in terms of capitalism and racism, are always the same. So if we actually can trust in our understanding of that, then we can anticipate these kinds of ebbs and flows, right? We know that, like, these dynamics are not breaks from an old order. They evolve to produce a modern world system, right? We're talking about racial capitalism. And that racial capitalism has always, you know, been dependent on past slavery, but present violence, present imperialism, present genocide. So those dynamics of power are still true. So let me tell you how that informs the question that you're asking. That means that, for example, you know, social media and other big tech platforms, you know, with their cookies and their analytics, that they learn far more about us than we'll ever know about them. That is racial capitalism. And that is something that if we understood racial capitalism better, we could have predicted in 2009 that these platforms would become watchers, right? that they would become systems of surveillance that invaded, all aspects of our life. We could have anticipated, right, that every major industry, that every aspect of Western economy would be digitized to some degree. I'm talking about artificial intelligence. I'm talking about the Internet of Things. I'm talking about augmented and virtual reality, cloud computing, blockchain, robotics, and autonomous vehicles. I'm saying, now, while I might not have been able to even imagine the autonomous vehicles and all of that, I could easily have anticipated, as could we all, that technology would be concentrated in the hands of the white and the wealthy, because that's how white power works, right? So right now, we're in a situation where over 50% of Americans say the internet has been essential during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? But we know that, I think it's 1/3 of K through 12 students don't have adequate connectivity. These are things, even could we predict a pandemic? Of course, because climate change has been telling us for decades, you're going to have pandemics, you're going to have climate disasters. And in those climate disasters, like we saw in Puerto Rico, like we saw in New Orleans, your redundant systems of technology are going to be important. We know already. This is what I'm trying to say. We do. We know all of this already. We know that the future of work includes extreme wage differentials and that worker rights are going to be undermined by increased automation. We knew it then in 2008, and we know it now. All that's required is a knowledge of white supremacy, and we have that. So am I surprised? Nah, not really.
That's a great way to sum it up. And I think it's a media and technology system that functions under racial capitalism will sacrifice democracy, civil rights, privacy, all of it, anything that we care about, worker rights, in function of money and profit. Let's pivot us to the last question, because I want to be a good host and get us out on time. You all have mentioned a lot of the ancestors that have really shaped this work today. We're part of a trajectory. We didn't just get here, and certainly I see myself as like maybe a little bit on the newer end of that trajectory, but certainly informed by you all. But you've mentioned from Janet Cyril to Ida B. Wells to Frederick Douglass and many other people that have seen the value of harnessing the power of media. So we're the living embodiment of those ancestor dreams. And so I want to end us on a hopeful note, to think about what is possible now. And I want to start with you, Joe. What do you see as being possible now? And I know Media 2070 is laying out both a history, but is also laying out a vision for a place where we want to be in 50 years. So what do you think we need to be doing now to make sure that trajectory is inevitable?
So man, so Malkia says so much, again, it's like, for me, it's like, Media 2070, obviously what we're doing currently right now is trying to force a reckoning with lawmakers and regulators to address the history of harm media policies have caused. So stay tuned. We're working on like how to force federal government to address its history of racism. For instance, in this, giving one example, in this city I live in the DC area, WTOP, which is all news station, was when it was originally licensed, it was a Klan. It was a license to a newspaper that was an organ of the Ku Klux Klan in 1927, right? And what's the history of exclusion? The first black person to own a radio station was 1949, well after the radio system was fully formed, right? And when you look at our media system, whether it's technologies come along, and whether it's the telegraph or radio or television, cable system, the cable television, now the internet, there's always an opportunity for new voices to enter. But then industry, along with the federal government, result in creating these laws that concentrate power in the hands of a few, and in a few dominant white folks, right? White owners, right? Or white controlled companies. So right now, just dealing with that reckoning, because we're still, there's so much of the story that we still need to know, right? even though in order to like in understanding that history helps us to understand like how to attack the problem a little more today when it comes to policy, let's say, right? But and it gets people a political education as well to understand that this is a media system that we're trying to make visible, right? Because often folks don't see a media system; they just think of the institutions and think of issues of representation. What makes me hopeful is, you know, the reckonings that are happening today. I like to think, right, that because every day we wake up in a country that it's fast becoming what this you know, the racial reckoning happening now and the white supremacist backlash. It's all because we're becoming a country that like people who look like us. It's gonna be a so-called multiracial democracy, which democracy not fully realized actually be achieved in this country, right? And that pressure, I like to think of addressing the structural inequities that exist in our society in every sector, whether it's the media sector, whether it's education, criminal justice, food, environmental. Like folks' lives are being impacted by this, and folks are going to continue to reckon and try and pressure the institutions to change. I like to think the reckoning happening now is not going anywhere and only is going to intensify, I hope and believe, over time, because when folks' basic needs are not being met, you know, and the coronavirus laid bare to that for journalists to see if they wanted to see, but they don't cover those issues of structural racism, right, within communities of color, not very well. That gives me hope that we can create the change. You know, we can create this change because it has to, like, we have to change it. You know, we have to change it in order to literally save lives and live in a more just society. So, you know, and just honestly working with folks like y'all and you and Mac and through the years and other folks and seeing what's happening outside, it gives me hope that we can actually we can do this. Like we can force a reckoning in this media system, and of course the journalists of color are doing that now, and as you said, Stephen, are being inspired, of course, by what's happening outside of their newsrooms. You know, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Joe. I want to toss it to you, Mac. Just give me 1 minute at the end of this hour to do the wrap up, but it's all you.
Yeah, I mean, Joe said it best. You know, we need some truth, we need some reconciliation. We also need some reparations. So, you know, some of that might come in the form of rethinking speech and the First Amendment in a digital age, in the context of white supremacy. We might be talking about real platform accountability, thinking about what the power of antitrust looks like, how we reclaim the distribution networks, you know, that have been developed. You know, maybe it involves really rethinking the digital economy from the ground up. You know, these companies, Amazon, Facebook, Palantir, Microsoft, Comcast, whatever, these are oligarchs. You know, this is an economic system that presupposes the disposability of everyday people, and maybe tax reform might be a way forward, a type of reparations, right? A way to expand the commons, which has always been our dream, you know, that this belongs to all of us. You know, what about affirmative action at news outlets? You know, we've allowed the right to decimate affirmative action, but we fought for affirmative action because it was needed, because white supremacy exists. What about BIPOC programs at journalism schools? What about the fact that we have a digital economy that is now fueling and funding a system of extraordinary mass incarceration? We need to get on the work of banning facial recognition, banning other police technologies to prevent their proliferation, even if we can't prevent their existence. We can do this. We can close this digital divide. We can reclaim the infrastructure of our culture, because that will reclaim the infrastructure of our dignity, of our freedom, and of our lives. And I believe that that's what this whole thing is all about.
Thank you, Mac. You know, if this conversation and in different times, this conversation would likely be happening on a stage somewhere at Busboys and Poets. There'd be the crowd would be standing up on their feet, clapping. So all I'll do for right now is give you a little sound effect to try to recreate that, because I'm so appreciative of both of y'all. That's right.
What it do?
I want to thank you both. Malkia Devich-Cyril, Senior Fellow at Media Justice, Joseph Torres at Free Press. I want to thank Media 2070, Media Justice, Free Press, and the Movement for Black Lives, and everyone who's taken part in this exploration of our Black narrative power. Please get connected with Media 2070. Go to the link that you see down here in the caption. Visit media2070.org. Keep the conversation going online with hashtag Black Narratives Matter. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you to my guest. Thank you for all the folks that were involved in pulling this event together. Much love, and please be safe.